The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. Joining you, as always, is myself. My name is Greg, and I'm here knowing increasingly more, but still very little about the Wheel of Time. And I will continue to say exactly that same joke every week from now on. And of course, our other host is Tylor. Tylor, it is a cold evening as we record this, and we've been away from the game for a little while. How are you doing, and how's your reading going?
I am doing very well, and I appreciate that your running joke is that you don't know that much about the Wheel of Time and you're learning a little bit more every week. And that is also kind of how I feel, given just how deep the lore is in this series. But things are going well. This is a 2-day week for those of us in academia, which is wonderful. We're recording just before Thanksgiving, and I don't really have anything else unless you have something. I say we dive straight into kind of an action-packed couple of chapters. Any last thoughts before we get into ill-advised discussions?
Only that you joked that I know very little. I will say I was recently on our podcast's Twitter feed, which follows a lot of Wheel of Time serious things, and I scrolled through like 10 memes. I'm like, I have no idea what any of this means. So, and then there was like a joke. I don't even remember what it was. It was like all blanks are blanks, and it was like 30,000 likes. I'm like, I don't know what that means. I don't get it. So anyway, so I'm still fresh and a newbie. Please guide us into one of your patented, ill-advised discussions of a visual object in a non-visual medium.
That's almost how I usually probably say it. Good work, Greg. So this week, we are going to be looking at the chapter icon on chapter 44. And this is a chapter icon we've actually mentioned a few times before. It is the trefoil leaves. So earlier in the book, we had mentioned, I just want to bring this up, Nynaeve and her herbs. We had mentioned this is something that comes up when we're in kind of natural environments or situations where nature skills seem to be really important. I think we had some like stealth and hunting type of chapters where this was included, and we had also talked about this as potentially being something that could symbolize the Tuatha An, the traveling people that Perrin and Egwene met. And so I want to toss to you, Greg, both to talk about the symbology, what you think when you look at this image, but also to take a guess at what is the last thing or things that would be included on our list of what do we think of when we see the trefoil leaves.
Well, this deep into our podcast journey, I think our readers deserve to know that while we are good friends and agree on a great many things, one of the things we agree about most strenuously is the fact that I love Wes Anderson and you hate Wes Anderson.
That is correct.
So I will say, when looking at this beautiful image, my Wes Anderson heart is awakened because it is largely symmetrical, right? And there aren't a lot of them, as we've explored, that fit that description. I would say it's not perfectly symmetrical, but it is, especially looking at the way the vines stretch and break the frame on either side, it's striking to me that they are exactly balanced, right? Of course. And what makes it not symmetrical is the shaping of the central leaf. I think the two other leaves are roughly there. So so what comes to mind as I look at this image? In my head, as you were talking, I was going, Ethelus, Kingsfoil, it's a weed, because it does remind me of the prominent place of that plant in the Lord of the Rings books. And as I recall now, and again, we should note, if we seem a little stuttery tonight, I think we both read this about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, a week and a half or so.
a week and a half ago and are late in recording for personal reasons that got in our way. So as I recall from those chapters I read very long ago, this is a part of the opening of the ways, right? There's
That's correct.
a
Yes.
design present at the gateway, and that opens it up, which was also a very Lord of the Rings moment to me. It was a very much a speak friend and enter moment. So thinking of that now, so we have well, and one last note on the actual visual, they are very much white, right? The detailing on them
Yep.
is very thin and black to give the leaves definition, but it is a white on a black background. And so thinking of this chapter, it's a force of light, and it opens up the pathways of the dark. So it's kind of that light before the dark symbol. Um, I had remembered that it was tied to Nynaeve in the past. I had not remembered that it was tied to the other people that were encountered. That you're gonna have to say it again.
Tuatha on, or the traveling people, if you prefer something a little easier,
Oh,
or the
okay.
Tinkers.
The Tinkerers. That's what I thought. I didn't remember Tuatha on. So that's really interesting to me as kind of an outlier, because if it was Nynaeve and it was this kind of doorway for the ways, those seem very purely forces of good or kind of natural power still. But I wouldn't fit the Ogier into that. And I know the ways are not
Yep.
strictly the Ogiers. They were created by the male Aes Sedai. Um, but nothing in that mythology has felt very natural to me, right? The way that
Yeah.
Nynaeve does and has those skills. So I think that makes me really curious. Then the last thought I'll give in my long ramble is you have also mentioned 3 different powers that use this symbol. And of course, the central symbol of this is not just leaves of 3, but 3 sets of leaves of 3. So it does feel to me like, oh, is there a power structure hidden behind this that we're about to learn more about?
Yeah, that's really interesting speculation. And it's right along kind of all of the right avenues. I don't want to confirm or deny anything specific too much, but you're definitely kind of talking about the right groups and the right ways of linking them together. And I think in some cases, you're identifying that there are really strong kind of literal connections to this symbol. I think you're right, like Nynaeve, nature skills. And then obviously the opening of the ways is it's called the Avendesora tree, I think, in the text, is the one that has these trefoil leaves. Those are all very kind of like literal connections that I think work really well. The connections to the other cultures that I think you were struggling a little more to find the links are much more metaphorical, right? So when we're talking about the Ogier, the only real connection that we have to this, other than their association with the ways, is the fact that Loyal keeps talking about trees as being really important to the Ogier. He wants to travel to see the groves. He loves the steading because of the trees that are there. And so leaves, trees, we get kind of that metaphorical connection. Even more metaphorical is the connection to the Tinkers, who follow what is called the way of the leaf. And so I often find this to be a really interesting symbol because it does a lot of lifting in a bunch of different ways. And so it's interesting to ask the question you're asking, is that because the metaphor connects them all in some way that in world makes sense? Or is it just because this is kind of a metaphor that works very well in different groups and different cultures? And so it just happens that the one symbol can stand in for multiple things. At this point in the series, we don't know. But the fact that even, only in book 1 of a 15-book series, we've got like 5 or 6 different things that one symbol can stand in for, probably keys us in that there's something going on here with this tree or the way of the leaf or something. These are obviously important ideas that are coming up over and over again.
I'd completely forgotten about the way of the leaf. So that makes that connection much more obvious to me. So I'm glad you filled me in on that. And then, yes, the Ogier traveling to find the different arbors, essentially. And, the only other bit I would add to that is it then makes me think of other trees in mythology. And this is obviously a very rich symbol over time. Probably first and foremost, the Bible with the tree of knowledge at the center of it, which in many ways feels like these gardens at the center of these cities that were planted in as ways for the path. But also things like Thor's world tree, right, from Norse mythology. It's not Thor's in the mythology,
Yeah.
just that's how most people know it, is from Marvel's Thor. But the tree being the kind of central connecting force between the realms in that mythology. And then here we have this as a symbol of connecting very disparate places kind of into one thoroughfare, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
One junction perhaps is better. So that resonates. And then just lastly, Game of Thrones. I don't know if the
Yeah.
show knew what to do with the trees. The trees felt very important in the books. And then they kind of came and went, I think is probably the most generous
Yeah.
way to say it in the show. But it did feel like there were times when those trees also formed some kind of connection. So, the obvious symbols of life, knowledge, connection all kind of fit with the tree. So that works for me.
Yeah, and I think that collection of kind of real world or mythological examples of trees being important fits in really well with one example of trees that we haven't mentioned yet, which is that in a previous chapter, when we were hearing about the history of Andor and the previous queen, we learned that the Aiel War began when the previous king of Carrion cut down a tree. And so we don't know what's going on there, but we have heard the felling of the tree is what began the Aiel War. So one more place that trees, even in the world mythology, seem to kind of stand out. So I think we've hit most of kind of the things I wanted to talk about here. I see Greg nodding, and I'm going to take that as an absolutely we're done. So why don't we then begin by diving into chapter 44, The Dark Along the Ways. And this is a chapter that is very much about characters walking from one place to another. We initially begin with everyone making their way first through the kitchen and then into the stables. Rand gets a new horse. It's named Red. It's named after its color, which is the same as Rand's hair. I just always thought that was kind of adorable, so I have to mention it. They then go through Master Gill's secret way out of the inn, which is an extremely narrow alleyway that doesn't appear to have an entrance to the back of the stable, but it does. And they then begin making their way through the streets of Camelin, with Loyal guiding them, somehow sensing where the way gate is and where they need to go. There's a couple of kind of fun moments where people almost see them or catch them, or someone sees Loyal and he's 10 times bigger than everyone else and just runs away but doesn't give them away. Eventually they make their way to the world's biggest cellar, because apparently you can fit like 12 people and horses inside of it. Moraine opens the ways using the Avendesora leaf. They make their way into the ways, and inside the darkness is oppressive. Rand literally just talks about the torches not extending as far as they ordinarily would. They make their way briefly from one island to another. They are marveling at what is going on, and the chapter ends after several of these bridges and islands with them arriving at a broken bridge and seemingly not able to progress any further. So this is your first time inside of the ways, Greg, and obviously there's a lot of different things going on in terms of plot here. So I'm curious just what stood out to you. What was your big takeaway from a pretty plot forward and yet somehow easy to summarize simply chapter, right? It was a lot of, and then they went to the place.
Yeah, there are a few things I would pick up on from your description, but let me just stick to the general, since that's what you asked about. And I will say, this was a rare time in the book thus far when I found myself having a lot of trouble picturing what was going on. I completely agree that the predominant description was just that it was dark, and so
Yeah.
you can like picture that. And again, this felt very Lord of the Ringsy to me. Again, probably because that's my reference point, but it very much felt like Khazad-dûm in the Fellowship of the Ring movie, the
Yep.
abandoned dwarf city going through the underground. And I think just the idea of the islands and the bridges was tricky because my mind kind of was naturally in like a cave space, but because we'd been in a cellar and so on. But I don't think that that's really accurate. And then
Yeah.
my mind kind of went to crazy like Star Wars World Between World type places. And I'm like, this doesn't really feel like the spirit of what's going on either, because while it is magical and kind of, I mean, I guess literally off the map, it still feels very kind of real. There are islands, there are bridges, and it's concrete and physical in a way that something like the world between worlds or an astral plane in different mythologies wouldn't really feel. So I think that just all summed up to me kind of, and I'm just being honest, I kind of go into skim mode. It's like, okay, what's happening? Okay, they're gonna keep walking. Yep. Okay. Bridge, island, bridge, someone's behind them. Okay, sure, whatever. And so it didn't grip me as much as other moments have. But I can't say that I really think that's a failing of the writer of Robert Jordan. I think it's more just me kind of having a lack of imagination.
Well, and I think that this contrasts for me between the ways and the entrance to the ways, because I
Hmm.
completely agree with you. I feel like when I'm thinking about the ways themselves, I have just kind of like a very like gray, flat, static image of just like it's blank, it's empty, it's, gray, flat stone. But I don't even know if that's exactly what was intended by Robert Jordan, right? The description is intentionally left almost how it makes you feel rather than what it looks like in a lot of cases, as opposed to the door to the ways, which is lushly described. And I feel like I can picture it, even though it probably got a lot less space for description than the ways themselves. And so I think that's interesting that Robert Jordan is almost, I never know whether it's eschewing or eschewing, or it's a word I've only read but not heard out loud. But that is what he is doing to visual details and description of the ways. And I think that's almost intentional to some degree, right? He's looking to disorient a little bit, and Rand isn't getting a lot of visual sensory details, so he's not giving us a lot of visual sensory
Hmm.
details. But maybe that's giving Robert Jordan too much credit for poor description of what's going on in the ways.
I think that, you weren't out to justify his choices, but I think that's a good recognition of the fact that, again, if we're relying on these narrators and we've had, it clear in the past that their perspective limits our perspective, it's not a kind of fake omniscient narrator just settled on the shoulder of one of these characters. I think that makes a lot of sense. A couple things I was thinking about, I had the good fortune to grow up in like rural New Hampshire, and there would be times where my friends and I would get to play like flashlight tag out in the dark, and you
Yeah.
go through the dark, and some of your ways of describing that, I'm like, yeah, that's what that feels like to me. Having now lived in a city for so long, you don't experience dark of that kind here.
Yeah.
But the real extreme dark, the pitch black, but you're out in it long enough that your eyes start to adjust. It is kind of a flat gray, like you just described, and so that resonates with me. And then the second thing that came to mind, I guess I'm turning this into Thor the glass columns. But the new Thor movie had Thor Love and Thunder had a scene where they sapped all the color out of it because they
Oh,
visited a
yeah.
planet, and in a kind of imperfect movie, it was probably the most visually striking part, and it kind of has that same feeling that we're stepping out of the kind of normal realm and into something magical and mystical. I like your note about how big the cellar was. It was definitely true that I was the whole time the chapter opened, I was thinking, okay, I'm counting how many people are noticing them. Like, okay, the stable
Yep.
boys, and then the kitchen, and I think if there's a message to take out of there, it's just that they were not unseen, right? That there are plenty of people who can pass the word. And again, my Star Wars loving heart went to A New Hope, where you get the alien who eventually was named Garindin or Long Snoot, following them around and making little noises and then reporting to the stormtroopers. It's kind of like, well, somebody here is going to report that this really weird party went into a basement and never came out. And so it seems to me like and I don't necessarily blame them. I mean, we know
Yeah.
their backs are against the wall, but it does seem to me like their choices are going to be very obvious as soon as the word gets passed, and that could put the ways at risk in addition to the party itself.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about this is that Moraine had hours and hours to plan, right? It's not as if this is something that she was doing on the spur of the moment, unexpectedly. We need to leave it this second. We in the previous chapter had found out, I think she basically decides we're going through the ways at what feels like in the narration 8 or 9 p.m. And this is, 4 or 5 in the morning. So if she wanted to prepare, she could have. Instead, her method of disguising the ogier they're traveling with was, let's find him a big horse and hope no one notices. So I think at this point it's probably reasonable, given how prepared we've seen Moraine be in so many other contexts, to presume that either she wants to be seen or she doesn't think the risk of being seen is especially high. But maybe I'm giving Moraine too much credit. I tend to be in the she seems omniscient to the kids' characters kind of perspective. So let's let her be omniscient until we find out otherwise.
Works for me. So my two other notes is just to note Loyal, who has seemed, at least in my vague assessment of him, kind of even keeled, is kind of angry about the desecration of the gate, that it, or the ways that it's hidden down here in this basement, and how it should be in a grove, as I understand it, right? That and so that was striking to me, and makes me think of, you have a lot of sadness ahead of you, right? Because this world is fallen, right? It's not idyllic anymore, so he's only going to have more disappointment. And then my last note, and then I want to hear what else you have, is for this chapter, is just that it was noted that the wheel turns faster in the ways. And I always perk up when we hear some mention of the wheel and the turning and all of that. So it seems as though while they will be journeying quickly, there is going to be a cost. It's going to accelerate plans. It's going to warp things a little bit more, was kind of how I took that line.
Yeah, so I think the way that it's described when they first go through the door is Rand makes his way through the door and then kind of immediately turns around, expecting someone will have followed after him. And when he turns back around, it seems as if they've like barely moved. So I think it actually kind of goes in the other direction. Rather than having a cost in terms of time, they're actually going to gain additional time, I feel like, right? They're going to feel like they're traveling for 2 days, but it may actually only be a day in the real world. So now, what does that do to someone to travel for 2 days in one day's time? We don't yet know, but I don't think it's necessarily, is there a cost in terms of time being lost, or in terms of if you spend too much time in the ways, what's going on? It almost looks like a time dilation sort of thing. It feels very science fiction-y to me. One end of the wormhole, time moves a little slower than on the other end.
Christopher Nolan, eat your heart out. Yeah. Yeah. Very much kind of the games he plays across his different movies. So,
Absolutely.
but you're right to note, even, if you're making a joke about, Interstellar. I couldn't even remember the name.
Yep.
That's how long I saw it once and never returned. But yeah, like, obviously the play there is how fast time on the outside. So it is the reverse of even an example like that. So.
Yeah.
Cool. What else you got?
So, in characters like this that are all plot oriented, all of my notes are usually just small character moments. So, I wanted to point just really quickly to a moment that happens in the stables fairly early in the chapter, when Matt walks up to Rand and basically tells him, like, hey, something is wrong with Heron. I can tell that he's acting odd. And Rand's response is to say, don't worry about it. Moraine knows, and she seems okay with it, so we shouldn't have a problem here. And Matt seems pretty placated. And I wanted to bring this up for two reasons. First off, because this is kind of our first chance to see suspicious Matt without the influence of the dagger. And so we get a chance to kind of see that character in a different light than we have recently. But also, I think it tells us something interesting about how Rand is perceiving Moraine, given that he immediately takes her acceptance as something that's worth trusting. And so I'd like to get kind of your perspective on both of those characters, Rand and Matt, and how you see them in these past few chapters as potentially being different from the last time that we've seen them around all of these other characters. Have you noticed any changes? And is there anything in that moment that jumps out to you as being interesting or important?
I think, to me, what's interesting about what you just described is how they had time away from Moraine, but somehow ended up in a space where they seem to trust her more, right?
Yeah.
Like, and maybe that is the recognition that the world is just much more dangerous than they thought it was, or that, there's greater dangers out there in some ways. So that to me is intriguing. And yet um, we continue to try to plumb out, or at least I do. I shouldn't project it onto you. Like, who is Matt, and how much of an influence the dagger has. Um, and so one of the things I was trying to pull up is we got a message from a listener, our good friend Ben. And so he was reacting to some of the things we said in chapter 41 about Matt. And what he notes is Matt has spent all of his energy keeping the dagger's influence at bay, mostly out of loyalty to Rand. Reaching the city and reuniting with the party has been the goal he clung to. They reach the city, and it doesn't achieve the full goal. Matt collapses and can't do anything but try to hold it together. When the party arrives, the full goal is achieved. Matt lets go and the dagger takes over. So kind of unfairly reading that much later than it is the moment it is reacting to, I think it's worth kind of putting in play again that all of us are trying to figure out who is Matt without the influence of the dagger. And what I like about Ben's read there is just that whatever small piece of Matt remained, it was loyal to Rand. Now, as the full party has regained, and what you're noting is that loyalty seems to extend beyond just Rand, perhaps, right? That he's now a little more trusting. Well, there's a mix there. So yeah, now I'm bouncing it back to you. How do you put some of those thoughts in play with what you're observing about the characters in this chapter?
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting about Matt in this chapter is that we see him in some ways act very much like we had come to expect of Matt with the dagger, right? He immediately is wondering, what's going on with Perrin. I think he also says something about like Egwene agreeing with Moraine. That might have been in the next chapter, but there's definitely a moment where he kind of picks up on a couple of things. And I think that tells us that what the dagger was doing wasn't just creating this kind of negativity or these feelings, right? It was preying on emotions within Matt, which is information that we didn't completely have before, right? We really hadn't seen suspicious Matt up to this point. We had pretty much just seen throw flour on dogs Matt and then evil dagger Matt. That was kind of his character progression. So I think because of this, we now have an idea that some of that suspicion was in him originally. But I also think there's something just very telling about the fact that Matt in these chapters reads as someone who, once he gets a reasonable explanation, will drop things and move on to the next. And that's very much not what we were seeing with the dagger. And so I actually kind of like that in the context of what Ben was talking about with kind of the dagger being resisted by Matt, because what we're clearly seeing here is that the dagger was in some ways, preying on Matt's emotions, but it was also just kind of re-emphasizing the same negative emotion over and over again, rather than I think Matt seems pretty good at setting those things aside, right? So it's both an internal struggle and something that is, taking his strengths and weaknesses and seeing them play out in the way that the dagger took over. So I think that's a really interesting observation.
Yeah.
Excellent. The other thing that I had to talk about, other than Perrin and Matt, unless you had anything else there with Rand and Matt, is I just wanted to talk a little bit about Moraine. In particular, the way that she reacts upon finding the Waygate, where we see once again kind of A, Moraine, who is always in control, but B, Moraine is this character who you've described, and you've kind of remembered this line repeatedly, that she came in search of stories, and she's kind of someone who is, after the stories of the world. And so what did you think, or did you think anything of the fact that Moraine clearly understands how to work the opening of a Waygate, something that not even Loyal is sure he knows how to do, despite being several hundred years older and from the culture that created these things? I think we're seeing a side of Moraine and just how deep her knowledge goes that we haven't so far.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't bump on it, I think because she felt so much in the Gandalf role in this chapter from the moment they're like running from the tavern, the inn, and into the basement. So again, as kind of that lead, it feels there. Now, seeing you emphasize that and putting on my metagaming hat, no, just thinking a little bit about it, it is an Aes Sedai creation. So it seems to me that whatever lore she possesses from her school not meaning her literal like institutional
Right.
institution of education, but from her school of magic, that she would have the knowledge of how it works as a part of that. Um, it is striking though that she always has the answers still, right? Like,
Right.
and like you joked a few minutes ago, it's like, yeah, it's hard not to just always trust her because she always is confident in acting decisively. And in this case, it's like, yeah, she's got the knowledge right away and um understands how it all works. And it's easy in light of that to remember from the last chapter that's like, oh, this is kind of a lost thing. Like nobody's used these in a really long time.
Yeah.
So I think because of her confidence, I just kind of bought into it and didn't really worry about it. But I think you're right to point out that that seems like it means she's much stronger or smarter or more knowledgeable than we even had reckoned before.
Yeah, and I think I would add to your list, right? You said smarter or stronger, or you had a big list going, and I would just add or more prepared, right? So far, she hasn't come up to a situation she didn't expect. And in part, it might just be because she knew what to expect, right? So I think
Mhm.
we should be keeping an eye on how many things in a row she seems to have known. That is everything I have for chapter 44. Once again, seeing a nod from Greg, I say we move on to chapter 45, what follows in shadow. So we are still at the broken bridge, and Rand is dismayed to find that not only does it look like there's nothing underneath the bridges, there is nothing underneath the bridges. They are suspended seemingly magically. Loyal is able to take them back and find them an alternate route to get to the Faldara Waygate. On the way, Loyal and Rand have a conversation where they both agree to see their own homes. He says, I'm going to go see the Steading. Loyal says, Rand, I will go see the Two Rivers. And Loyal then actually very kind of differently than we normally see. He's kind of an upbeat character typically. His response is, are you sure we'll ever actually be done with all of this? And that just seemed like an interesting moment for that character. After that, they get to one of the islands and they decide to take a rest. Loyal then starts talking about how things once grew on the islands. Perrin briefly states there was nothing to hunt, though, so it didn't matter. And then Moraine basically is talking about why she's not using the power in the ways. And she talks about how because it was made with the tainted one power by men, she's worried that any use of the power would potentially be corrupted. Finally, we get an interesting interaction between Moraine and the kids, where Moraine is talking about how all of the different people are involved and tied with one another. And then Rand asked whether Min showed that. And then Egwene asked how Rand knows about Min. And then Perrin brings up Aram. And then Matt brings up Elsie Grinwell. It's a fun conversation. We're definitely going to talk about it at least a little bit. I'm proud that I was able to do all of those names without
Yeah, that
looking
was
at my
impressive.
notes. Uh, in the morning, we then get the first kind of real intriguing piece of plot information we've had in a little while. Land tells us that someone is following the party. He doesn't know who, but last night when they stopped, he said someone almost came upon them and then went back an island so they could follow at a distance. But it's decided by Moraine, basically, there's nothing we can do about it. Let's assume it has nothing to do with us. Let's keep moving. At this point, they continue making their ways. It's bleary, it's dark. And then Rand hears some wind. Loyal realizes there shouldn't be wind in the ways, and so this must be the black wind. And so they begin running. They're only 2 bridges away, and they eventually make their way to the island that is supposed to have the exit into Faldara, and there is no key to get out through the gate. And so Moraine, despite knowing that the power will be tainted, starts using the power to burn a hole through whatever wall is there. She creates a hole. Everyone gets through it. And as they're trying to seal it, they have a close encounter with the black wind. It's horrifying. It's pretty gross. No one likes it. And that's where we leave the chapter, with a newly sealed exit to the Waygate at Faldara and something ahead of our characters. We actually don't get any description of what is outside the Waygate. So we have now completed one trip through the ways. What were
Hmm.
your big takeaways from this journey?
It was funny because the first half of your description was kind of beat for beat my notes. And then you went into like all this stuff that I totally didn't remember. So I don't know if I petered out halfway through my notes, but so a very interesting set of circumstances within this. What it reminds me of as a chapter is when you are DMing us and we're like marching somewhere or we're on a spaceship, depending on what game we're playing. You tend to be like, okay, your characters have 2 days. What do they do? Like what conversations do they have, if any? And we just kind of piece that together. And so it is very much that kind of chapter. Like, yep, we're just moving. We have all these people. Let's just fill in some of the pieces that they each need and catch each other up as you move forward.
It kind of reminds me of like a Noah Baumbach or like Greta Gerwig movie where, yes, they're kind of a plot and yes, they're strung together
Mm,
scenes that relate to each other, but sometimes it just feels like you're dropping scenes in the middle of nowhere with no connection. That's often how I feel about chapters like this. It's like, and
mm,
then they walked scene, and then they walked scene, and you don't
yeah.
need as much linkage for chapters like that.
So the part of my notes that you very much resonate with, I also hit on that. What makes you think this will ever be over? And particularly the wording of that, because it could have been what makes you think we'll survive this, but it's
Yeah.
not that. It's what makes you think this will ever be over. And I think there's a version of that is kind of like when you get involved in the wider world, it just keeps going, right? Like, our darling 18-year-old students who like are just becoming politically aware and they're like, we're gonna change the world. And it's like, like
I mean, let's be real. Our darling 18-year-old students did change the world a little
probably
bit,
saved
but
democracy last
yeah.
week. Yeah, or 2 weeks ago, but totally fair. But there is this attitude of like, I just need to do these things and then it's done. And it's like, oh
Yeah.
no, when you join a fight like American politics, it's the rest of your life. And that's just what the rest of us have embraced as a part of this. But again, it is good that they bring their optimism to it. But I really liked that moment. Again, thinking of I guess I'm in a Tolkien mood tonight, but like when the hobbits are at the end of their journey in Mordor, Sam and Frodo, it's like, do you even remember what the Shire was like? Do you even remember the taste of strawberries? And it's this way that it really makes you remember that there's going to be a brutal cost to this. They're not, if they get to go home, they will be so changed by what they experience that it's not going to be right anymore. So I really liked that moment. And also the fact it was between Rand and Loyal, because it's like, oh yeah, we're buddies now. Let's bridge these divides. And it's like, I don't know if the world's gonna accept that.
Yeah, and I think for Leal as a character, this is maybe the first time ever that we've seen him negative. Even when Rand is telling his story about being attacked by dark friends and Trollocs, his immediate reaction to that is awesome. Can I go too? And
Mm.
so for a character with that kind of blind enthusiasm and willingness to disregard, his own safety, he literally ran away from home 10 years before he was supposed to. That's really interesting to see a
Mm.
character go from zero to giving up that quickly. I actually just wanted to bring up another moment that kind of quickly follows this one, and it's where they stop briefly and first talks about how things used to grow in the ways, and I thought that was just a really lovely image, and the way that Loyal was clearly longing for it in that conversation was really wonderful. But then Perrin, kind of seemingly out of nowhere, responds by saying, yeah, but there was nothing to hunt. And I thought that was a really telling moment for both of those characters. And I think it's really interesting for Perrin in particular, because we've actually been in his head relatively recently when he was learning about the wolves and when he was first being exposed to that information. And then we kind of haven't really been in his head much since then. And so to see just how much he's internalized some of that and is now kind of thinking and talking like a wolf, I think it's very interesting to see how quickly that's progressed.
You're saying he's hungry like a wolf? The wolf? The wolf.
The wolf.
Um, Yeah, and it is funny how mentally I so swapped Matt being consumed by the dagger and Perrin being consumed by his wolfiness. But this is two reminders in each of these chapters that it's growing and it is of concern. And when what comes to mind is how the white cloaks were like, that's the darkness. Is it the darkness that's pulling him that way, or it's just having an effect? But I actually returned to the boys from last chapter. And it's like, well, if Moraine's not worried about it, then I'm not worried about it. Like,
Yeah.
I think we'll have a different Perrin, but it won't be a bad Perrin, even if this is kind of an off-key moment, right? Like, it used to be beautiful. There's nothing to hunt, right? Like,
Yeah.
It could also be a little bit of one of those things like, well, how did Moraine know how to open this? Well, how did Perrin really know what was here? How did he know there was nothing to hunt here? Is this wolfiness taking over him in a different way? Um, Gosh, and then that makes me think of back when they did their battle cries that they didn't know. Like, what is under the surface? What is in the deep recesses of these characters that is being awakened, perhaps by wolfiness?
Yeah, and I think while you are thinking about kind of diving into the subconscious and kind of how deep does this go, my question is actually the opposite question, which is how long has Perrin been talking like this? Because this is kind of the first time that we are seeing someone other than Perrin experience Perrin the wolf, right? Because every time so far that we've seen a character kind of notice Perrin's yellow eyes or acknowledge that Perrin can speak to wolves, it's been done in a chapter where we were in Perrin's head. And so I'm also curious about whether him saying things like nothing to hunt is something he knows he's doing, right? We've heard Perrin's internal dialogue do that a few times. I'm curious whether he's been saying that out loud for a while and it's been showing up in italics because that's what Perrin thinks he's doing. Because there's no real sign, I think, in either of these instances in the two chapters that Perrin is kind of intentionally being wolfy, if that's how we're going to refer to it.
Sure. Hey, so I have something in my notes that you didn't mention in your summary, unless I blacked out for a second or something. Moraine thinks Tom's alive.
Oh, yes, she does.
Right. And so that's kind of an exclamation in the middle of my page of notes that, again, not confirmation, but we've kind of assumed. And, once Moraine says it, then I'm very sure he's out there somewhere. And it's interesting to think how far we're leaving him behind. And to me, that makes me think how many books till we see him again, that it might be a long time. But it seems that the clue is really being emphasized that he's still out there, right? And this is the boys were skeptical, but then the innkeeper was sure, and Moraine is sure. So anybody with some strong kind of world knowledge seems sure Tom's fine, or maybe not fine, but he's still out there. So I feel like that's being planted so strongly in our minds because it's going to come true.
Yeah, and I think the interaction between Moraine and Rand when they're talking about Tom is really interesting because Moraine starts by saying, I'm fairly confident Tom is alive, which, first of all, is interesting because Moraine says it without any prompting. She doesn't get asked specifically about Tom, and she's been typically pretty tight-lipped about things like this. So the fact that she's sharing information is definitely a little bit of a change for her. But then Rand's reaction is, how do you know? Did Min say anything about him, right? And Min was the fortune teller who they saw back in Baerlon. And at first, Moraine gives kind of her very typical kind of dismissive dance around the question answer. She basically just says like, and I'm not going to say anything. That girl saw a lot of things. But then at the end of the kind of paragraph of discussion where she says she saw that all of your destinies were bound together, she saw that all of you are important, she does say, and she saw many things about all of you and Tom. So we may get a little bit of the information of why Moraine seems so sure that Tom is alive. If Min, the fortune teller, saw something about Tom and told Moraine about it, she might have information that Tom is going to live long enough to fulfill whatever prophecy Min made. So this does seem like pretty definitive confirmation. And like you say, when Robert Jordan tells you a character is alive this many times, you should probably just believe them. They're probably alive.
Yeah. And I guess it's right before that we get this confirmation that the one power is corrupted here. I think we'd had a hint of that prior to entry into the ways or something.
Yeah, so we knew that the ways were created by the one power that was tainted, and it was kind of suspected that's why the ways no longer have light or no longer grow trees. But what Moraine is telling us is that's not just something that infects the ways or the male half of the power. It also could potentially affect her, even though the female half of the power isn't tainted in the same way that the male half is. So I think that's something really interesting, even if we had gotten some kind of hints of taint. The fact that it kind of bleeds over into the other half of the power is unique among anything we've seen so far.
And again, in a moment where we're really expanding the kind of mythological capacities of this world and this really different kind of magic, it's like, oh, okay, and it's not its own thing. It's all woven into the pattern and into the other powers that be here.
Yeah, and I
Uh
believe. Oh, go ahead.
no, you.
I believe immediately after all of this discussion of Tom and the power being tainted and all of that is a big fun teenage fight about boys and girls. So we definitely need to talk about that at least a little bit. I thought this was just a fun scene with all of the boys kind of ragging on either Egwene or Rand depending on who they traveled with. Kind of bringing up all of the men or women who they interacted with. But I also thought it was really telling that we're getting to a point in the relationship of these two characters where it feels like 20, 30 chapters ago, whenever we had a big kind of confrontation between Rand and Egwene, it felt like the most important thing in Rand's chapters, right? He really cared about what was going on in his relationship with his father and with Egwene and with the people around him. It's a sideshow here, right? And so I'm curious what you think about the continued inclusion of these kind of relationship dynamics in the midst of a pretty, big old apocalyptic type story, and how you think it plays kind of as it does here as a very brief interlude.
More than anything, it seems like a reminder that they're young, that it would be as this, world spins up and this mythology gets crazy, you can forget that they're very young people, and there's always been a line of a philosopher, gosh, I'll look up who it is in a little while, that says like we toil in libraries reading books of great thinkers, forgetting that they were once young men like ourselves, right? That like all they are people trying to figure it out too. And so it's that kind of reminder of like these are young people and they're not perfect and they're going to make mistakes. But it is what you said as well, which is that, if we were in Two Rivers, this is all there is. Like
Yeah.
who's gonna marry who and who's gonna do this. And now it is very much like, oh, well, those parts of yourself aren't gone. You still have those feelings. There's still this kind of tension, but it is so much smaller than you ever imagined. And boy, does that define high school or what, right? Like
Yeah.
this drama that encloses upon poor 17, 18-year-olds, and it really doesn't matter. You don't know those people after just a couple years.
Yeah, if you're 17 or 18, just know nothing you do right now is really that important.
Never,
Just you
never.
should be aware. Uh,
Except for saving democracy. Thank you,
yeah,
18 year
please
olds.
go save democracy. That would be great. Um, I think aside from all of this kind of relationship drama and all of the things getting brought up, there's one line in here that jumps out at me that I'm curious whether you've picked up on it, because it's about the fifth or sixth time it happens. In this chapter, Rand is talking to Egwene and feels like he's losing the conversation, and he says, "Man, I wish I was more like Perrin. He knows how to talk to girls." And in multiple Perrin chapters, we have read Perrin going, "Man, I don't understand what's happening at all. I wish I was like Rand. Rand knows how to talk about girls." And this happens all the time. And I think it's a really kind of fun joke that Robert Jordan has worked in, that all of the teenage boys think all of the other teenage boys have it together, when in reality no teenage boy has ever had it together. uh, and I think that it's really effective, but it will also become something that is unfortunate about Robert Jordan, which is once you realize the things he does over and over again, you will realize how often he does them over and over again. So get ready for Rand to think Perrin knows how to talk about girls a lot.
Boy, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that is all of us teenage boys, right? That everybody else was ahead of us in the race to find a partner or what have you. So I really like that just naturalistically. It also just brought to mind social media, right? That we all sit around looking at each other's posts and thinking, "Oh, damn, why aren't I out doing that thing with them?" Or, why can't I do things that fun or what have you? And like, yeah, we all have our nights when we're doing when we know what's going on, but most of the time we just don't. We are also sitting at home in our sweats or what have you.
Which is exactly what I am doing right now. Podcasting can be a relaxed activity. Assuming that we're done with the relationship drama, I then want to talk about the revelation that comes the next morning when Lan tells them someone is following us. And I want to leave this as general as possible, mostly because I think this would be an effective place for a Greg's possibly wrong prediction. Who do you think is following them and why?
Gollum, right? I mean, it just again, I was in a very Lord of the Rings mood, and it was exactly like that scene where Frodo and Gandalf talk about who's following them. So,
Yep.
In Greg's potentially wrong speculation, irresponsible speculation corner, um, I think because of that, I assumed it might actually be a force for good, somebody who is tracking along with them and trying to help and trying to come along. Um, Somebody who seems foul but is fair, right?
The
And
old
so
Aragorn.
yeah, exactly. So so that's where my mind went. I think as it continues into the Black Wind, that feels a little less likely that there's something really dangerous there. Now, the list of people who could be following them has grown pretty short in general because we've caught up with so many. And I would take Tom out of that mix because he was kind of, somebody lampposted that, hung a lantern on it. I forget the phrase, but I don't know. But because he comes up so prominently in the chapter, it kind of couldn't be him. It wouldn't be him
Yeah.
like right on their tails. Um, but my mind is really wondering whether it's somebody who slipped in the door behind them and is following them that way, or if it's somebody who is already here crossing. It felt to me from the moment that Loyal said these are old ways that nobody uses. It's like nobody uses, right?
Yeah.
That I'm sure something that powerful would not lay fallow, and that somebody would be making use of that. And if nobody uses it, then you don't know that nobody else is using it in there, that nobody's been passing through there. And everything from the broken bridges and onward suggests that there's been activity here, and it's not that they've sat empty. Um so I'm gonna still say it's somebody positive. It's a force for good. I don't have a good candidate. I mean, I think all the royals are off getting ready for their caravan and wouldn't have been able to slip away. I don't think of anybody at the inn as rising prominently enough to like warrant, because if they like in 2 chapters were like, oh look, it's the guard from the inn, I'd be like, who is this guy again? Like I don't remember what his name was or what have you. So
Yeah.
so that's the best I got. It feels like it's something unexpected. The presence then of the Black Wind, though, makes me nervous that if it was somebody good, it could be then corrupted by this. And the kind of dramatic and very much an Indiana Jones, like, I don't know, the trap
Yeah.
is closing in and you got to get through the doorway. I guess they don't roll under the door, but that kind of tense moment makes me really wonder what's there. And the Black Wind seems so dark and powerful that just makes me think of Beelzemon. So I'll just jump to the complete opposite side of the spectrum and just cover all my bases. It is
Yeah.
somebody who's either good or on a spectrum over to the Dark One himself. So someone on that spectrum.
Yeah. So just a person is what
A
you're
person,
saying. Yeah.
something. Well, and not necessarily a human, just an entity of some kind. Yeah.
Well, and I think in your discussion, as you're talking about the ways being kind of lost and Loyal being so confident no one is using them, but of course, no one is checking whether anyone is using them, tied up in that is the revelation that we have in this chapter 1 that one of the guide stones in the ways has been destroyed and appears to have been destroyed by Trollocs.
That's right.
And then 2, Moraine says that must be how the Trollocs got to the 2 rivers, right? Because this is a mystery we had very early in the book and then kind of left behind was Lan saying it's not possible for 3,000 Trollocs to get this far south without anyone noticing them. We now have an answer to that riddle. it's the ways. And so there's this interesting dynamic that's building of this thing that was supposed to be empty is both haunted by the madness that created it and is the pathway for evil, and someone is following them. Places that are supposed to be empty being crowded feels like it should set off some warning signs as far as what's going on here, and how, like you're saying, the darkness and the leaders of darkness are positioning their pieces seemingly exactly where all of our characters are.
Yeah. And, not to end the discussion, if you have more to say, but I will say, like, clock is ticking. Like, we are now under 100 pages left in this book. And so I still find myself questioning, is this about to have a kind of climactic confrontation? A battle doesn't seem likely, but some kind of confrontation at this point to close it out. Or have we kind of seen that already and it's going to kind of be a whimper, and then the kind of classic, is it going to be a complete book, or is it going to be a cliffhanger? And I think all of that is kind of balanced in my mind as I debate who's following and how much more we're going to see. I have the awful habit when I'm in a movie theater of kind of clocking, like, okay, I know it's a 2-hour movie, and how, like, I'll check that watch and be like, okay, about how much is left? Is this it, or is there a little more? When you really should probably just stay in the moment. But it does feel like I'm feeling that way at the end of this book. I'm really curious. But the flip side of that is Robert Jordan has crafted something where I don't have the answer. I don't have a very clear sense of exactly how these last 100 pages are going to play out. And in the majority of fantasy I've read, which again, I don't read fantasy despite the many references I make to it, I often find that I'm often just waiting for it to wrap up in the way I expected, rather than this position where I'm like, 90 pages to go and I really don't know what they hold. So yeah, it makes it our little break we accidentally took, even though hopefully the readers hear no break. It makes the break we took super frustrating, because I was ready early last weekend. I'm like, let's do this. Like, I'm good to go. And then life intervened. So that's where I'm sitting as we head into the next chunk of the book.
Yeah, and this actually leads perfectly into the last very tiny moment that I wanted to mention in this chapter, which is we finally got rid of Moraine's staff, which was my one slip up very early in this show where I mentioned that staff leaving. It's as close to a spoiler as I think I've gotten so far. She uses the staff to burn the hole in the wall, and then she throws it away charred and broken. And to me, I think that is just a perfect image for what Robert Jordan is doing at this point in the book, right? He began very much in the Tolkien playbook. He basically just says, like, look, I'm going to give you the Shire more or less word for word out of Tolkien. And then he slowly starts to move away from it. And then now is the moment where he says, okay, now the group's back together. They're going to unexpectedly go somewhere where you don't expect them, and they're going to run away from what feels like the big climactic moment that could be the end if this was a cliffhanger book. Where do we go from here? I think Robert Jordan is doing a very good job of signaling, like, the Gandalf staff is gone, the gloves are off, you're going to see my story now, not anyone else's. And I think that's an exciting place to be in, like you say, a genre that in many cases is defined just as much by the tropes that it follows as it is by the ones that it breaks, right? Fantasy is a very kind of by the numbers. I know everything's the story circle in your world, but it's a particular type of the story circle over and over in Fantasyland.
I wouldn't know. I don't read fantasy, so I just saw somebody maybe on the street or maybe in Starbucks walking around with Patrick Rothfuss. I'm like, oh yeah, there's one of those fantasy books I don't read. Very funny to me that continues to be a joke, at least to me, that I read a ton of fantasy and I just don't recognize it or don't acknowledge that part of myself. So uh that's very interesting. I had Qui-Gon opening up the Trade Federation door in my mind when she was doing that. That was the imagery I took. And then, in Tolkien, the breaking of a wizard's staff is dramatic and important. So to take that, got rid of it and yet threw it right into a dark force, and something is following them. So, heyo, I see you covering your mouth and not spoiling, or itching your mustache, one or the other.
Both is still on the table. And
Sure.
I think this is exactly what Robert Jordan is trying to do at this point in the book, right? He is giving us a lot of the interesting character moments and interesting plot details that we're really looking for. He continues to world build. And he also is playing the game of when will you know what the conclusion is. He kind of keeps moving that goalpost a little bit. We really expected to be heading towards Tar Valon, and now we are suddenly hundreds of miles north of it. And so I think we're very much at the point where Robert Jordan is putting the pieces into play, but we don't know what game is being played yet. And so it's really tricky to figure out exactly where things are moving. But next week, we are going to be getting towards a little bit more of this plot detail and a lot more world building. These are a couple of my favorite chapters for kind of filling in gaps of some things that have really been mysteries for us so far. So next week, we are going to be reading chapter 46, Faldara, and chapter 47, More Tales of the Wheel, which, by the way, is the name of a chapter that is in reference to, I think, like chapter 4 or 5, Tales of the Wheel. So it's a deep callback this late in the book. And Greg, I'll let you give kind of last thoughts as we move into these next couple of chapters, but I'm looking forward to it. Say goodbye to the people.
The wheel continues to turn, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. It depends whether you're in the ways or out in the world. So I think just to call back to our own reference multiple times, the roller coaster is off the tracks now. We're going nuts, and there's a lot happening here. So we hope you continue to enjoy this and that you will cling tenaciously to the roller coaster cart as we crash into the last 100 pages of this book and see where it goes from here. So until next time, we will see you through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.